And what's terrifying for me is that my homeland, the country where I grew up and lived for 38 years before I left for Estonia, that my homeland is doing this. They're taking him for the second time. We've had no contact with him. He's been in captivity for 4 years. Since then, for 4 years, we haven't had any information about him. They wake up at 6. They line them up with the legs spread, make them stand. If one of them moves, they beat everyone. And they stand like this, from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m.
Since the outbreak of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, OSW has been informing about the situation on the front, about the reactions of Russian society, about war crimes committed by Russians, both against Ukrainians and against their own soldiers, about the fact that the violence of the Russian army is not accidental, but systemic. In this film, we'll look at one Russian opposition activist's investigation into concentration camps in the occupied territories of Ukraine and in Russia itself, about the system of terror against the civilian population used by Russian intelligence. We will also talk with a mother whose son is being held in one of these camps. This film is about facts, findings, and testimonies that show the criminal Russian system, a system that murders Ukrainian civilians. According to Ukrainian data, the identities of 15,000 people who are held in Russian concentration camps have been confirmed, while 70,000 Ukrainian civilians have gone missing without a trace. In reality, no one is able to determine exactly how many Ukrainian citizens have been captured by the Russians and how many are in prisons. We speak with Yevgenia Chirikova, a Russian activist and author of the film Prisoners, the System of Terror. Yevgenia has been placed on the list of terrorists and extremists and has been arrested in absentia twice. In 2015, she left with her family for Estonia. Since the beginning of the war, she has been helping Ukrainians, mainly those who escaped from Russian-occupied territories to Europe and Estonia.
We were the first to learn about filtration. Our first documentary, our first interview about filtration, was conducted with a Ukrainian refugee in March 2022, and we immediately asked ourselves, what happens to the people who didn't go through filtration? That question stuck with us like a splinter in our heads. It was there all the time. And because we ran a prison assistance program, literally half a year after the start of the Russian aggression, our lawyers began to find Ukrainian civilian prisoners in Russian correctional facilities. We started helping these people. We also really believed that we would be able to free a particular Ukrainian female prisoner. Her name was Tatyana Plechkova. She was there with her husband. She was a civilian. She was kidnapped along with her husband in Melitopol from their home. Tatyana was my age. I was convinced that this woman wasn't really needed by anyone. She wasn't particularly important to the FSB or any other agencies. She wasn't in the military. We were sure that we could somehow free her because in 3 years we managed, legally or not, to free 3 Ukrainian prisoners, 3 volunteers. But we didn't succeed. Tatyana died. Instead of freeing her, she was sent, naked, covered in bruises, straight from prison in a coma to a hospital in Melitopol, and died there. She died after being in prison. We understood that this was a real tragedy, that a person died after contact with the Russian FSB machine. We understood that we had to make an outcry about this. We started gathering information, being more active, together with Ukrainian human rights defenders, with civilian rights movements. We started reaching out to families of Ukrainian civilian prisoners, and that's when I met Tatyana Omelyanenko, the mother of Damian Omelyanenko, a Ukrainian civilian prisoner. She introduced me to more relatives of Ukrainian civilian prisoners, and that's how we gradually began to gather testimonies. We collected testimonies from human rights defenders, both Russian ones who helped Ukrainian prisoners in Russian correctional facilities and Ukrainian ones. We also conducted conversations with prisoners' families and understood that the picture of the situation was absolutely terrifying.
И мы поняли, что картина совершенно ужасающая.
Yevgenia discovered that Ukrainian civilians are held not only in prisons in the occupied territories, but also in at least 180 prisons inside Russia.
Но далее мы продолжаем наше расследование.
We are continuing our investigation and now reaching people directly, Ukrainian civilian prisoners who were in concentration camps and miraculously escaped from them. We are working on another film because we understand that these are not isolated cases of tortures, but a real system of terror.
Это настоящая система террора.
I look up and see my husband, who has already gotten up, being surrounded by about 10 soldiers with rifles.
Бегут там около 10 военных с автоматами.
They surrounded him. An armored transport was standing on the road. They took my husband there. I asked them to release him. I was told they would check him and bring him back in an hour and a half. Since then, I have had no news of him, and it's been 4 years.
С тех пор у нас нет о нем никакой информации уже 4-й год.
My name is Elena Shevchenko. I am the mother of a civilian prisoner. On March 15, 2022, he was leaving the city of Polochy in Zaporizhia Oblast from an occupied city on territory controlled by Ukraine. He was stopped at the last checkpoint without any explanation. They simply pulled him out of the car and said, "You're not going any further." That's it. Russian soldiers transferred him to another vehicle. Since then, I haven't had contact with him. He's in captivity for the 4th year. I have no contact, and I haven't even heard his voice.
4-й год он находится в плену. Никакой связи нет, я его не слышала.
Новопсков, русский мир прийшов. Новопсковчани, скажіть, Україна! Україна! Україна!
What does the terror system in the occupied territories look like? A Russian military person, sometimes it's an FSB officer, sometimes Rosgvardia, which is the military police, and sometimes unknown people in balaclavas. This person detains a civilian. The reason? Speaking Ukrainian, volunteer activity, sometimes just helping neighbors. A person can disappear without a trace. He is not charged with anything, no proceedings are conducted against him, and there are no documents confirming his detention. When the Russians entered a location, they practically immediately began to catch people who could potentially be dangerous to the new authorities. For example, local activists, soldiers, people who have some connections with the armed forces, who could offer active resistance. Such people immediately became suspects. They were sought out mostly by the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation.
Покажи накол. Но на Азовскую, да, не похоже.
Мобильник. Сейчас. Заряженный? Откуда? В смысле? Ну, машина. Ну, блядь, 4 дня уже, блядь, заряженный. Машина. И что, я похож?
Te działania często łączyły się z...
These actions were often combined with fake evacuations, the tactic of creating so-called filtration camps. The Russians often created an excuse that supposedly some evacuation of the civilian population from the occupied territories was necessary, and people ended up in camps. In these filtration camps, people were separated into those who were potentially dangerous to the new authorities, those who could somehow be intimidated, and those who posed no threat. People who were considered a threat were most often deported to Russia. These people were often tortured, beaten. It was very easy to be suspected of being a dangerous person because the Russians checked personal laptops and phones. They even had equipment that allowed them to review private conversations on Telegram or Messenger. And if someone was suspected of potentially being such a person, they were usually deported. A network of additional camps was even created, placing deported people in locations near the border with Ukraine, for example in Rostov-on-Don or in Taganrog. I asked her, "Why are you talking to me in Ukrainian?" "I want it that way," she answers. We took her to the nearest checkpoint, handcuffed. and they put her in the basement.
И когда оккупанты заходят,
When the occupiers enter occupied territory, they already have lists prepared of people, civilians who they want to kidnap and torture. Not prisoners of war, just ordinary people, active locally. These aren't some super fighters. They're active people who help others.
люди, которые помогают другим.
We speak with the mother of a boy, Damian, who has for 3 years been in a Russian concentration camp. Damian studied at a military school and also attended a military club. The Ukrainians didn't have time to destroy or transport documents from the military commissariat. The person who helped in Damian's detention was his coach. How did you get into this arrangement? My mother suggested it to me. She suggested that I take this up, and I agreed.
These lists reached the FSB, and they began to purposefully organize raids in Berdyansk. They tracked these boys according to addresses. They took my son for the first time at the end of May, for a month, and I didn't know what was happening to him. My mother went there, to the military police, to the headquarters. They told her nothing. Only later it turned out that for a month they held my son in a cell. They subjected him to torture, forced him to cooperate, and tried to persuade him to accept a Russian passport. He refused.
Его пытали, его склоняли к сотрудничеству, его склоняли к взятию российского паспорта, он отказывался.
They did release him for a time, but again he had to report regularly. As a result of these tortures, he later had broken ribs. Getting medical help was very difficult. Hospitals had a ban on providing medical care to such people. So, secretly, on our own, we turned to a doctor who examined him and tried to help him as much as possible. That doctor was later also taken.
Мы там своими силами тихонечко обратились к знакомому доктору, который там его осмотрел и как-то пытался ему там помочь. Впоследствии этого доктора тоже.
For 3 days, they beat him and tortured him. Most people, periodically, especially men, practically everyone, went through it, these so-called basements. Only some were released and even allowed to leave, but they didn't release Damian, didn't give him the opportunity to leave. In November, he was detained. November 16, 2022, he was taken for a second time and charged with baseless accusations of terrorism and later also espionage.
Его забирают второй раз и предъявляют ему необоснованные обвинения в терроризме и впоследствии еще в шпионаже.
Most detainees are subjected to so-called special verification, a procedure that does not exist in Russian law. This is coercion of testimony, hunger, torture.
Человека схватили, его начинают пытать.
They grab a person and start torturing them. These are systemic tortures, and when we check testimonies from different people, human rights defenders, freed prisoners, prisoners of war, we see that these tortures are systematic in nature. In different places, they torture in the same way. They even use identical generators. In some places, there are more sadists. In others, fewer, but overall, it looks as if they were acting according to an established methodology. That's the impression. We know this from Mikhailo Salvo, a Ukrainian human rights defender.
Суд допросил 3 перебежчиков из этой системы карательной путинской, которые решили поделиться.
Currently, the International Criminal Court has interviewed 3 former officials of Putin's penal system who decided to share information about how exactly this terror and these tortures look. These people, connected with the FSB and the system, provided information that at the beginning of the invasion, a meeting was held at the highest level, and it was then that an order was issued to use torture. An assurance was given that those who applied it would not suffer any consequences for it. That's why torture affects over 90% of Ukrainian civilian prisoners and prisoners of war, and these are the most terrifying tortures. This means sexual violence, beatings, both with legs and hands, using batons or other means of direct coercion. Stun guns are also used. Sexual violence is common in the most perverted forms, both against men and women.
A report has been created about the sexual crimes committed by Russian soldiers. It was prepared by the Lemkin Center at the Pilecki Institute in Poland. The authors of the document collected testimonies from victims and described these crimes in detail. There was a girl with a very beautiful figure. They were all raping her. She had long red hair. She reminded me of an actress. When I asked her why she was there, she replied that her brother was in the armed forces of Ukraine and that's why they took her. For 6 months they carried her with them. For 6 months they raped her. She was about 35 to 36 years old. They took her again and again and brought her back after some time. It's hard for me to even talk about it. You could see from her that she just didn't want to live anymore. They brought me at 4 in the morning. The torture ended around 6. They tortured me without a break, beat me, hung me by my hands so they would twist backwards like on a torture wheel. They put handcuffs even on my fingers. I was sick, but they still used electric current. Of course they attached electrodes to my body, to my ear. It looked like they were burning tattoos on a person's body.
We also document violence and torture against teenagers. They have a term, phone call to mom. They tell the child that they're calling their mom. The child gets happy, and then they connect them to a device and shock them with electrical current. We also recorded such cases.
If the FSB thinks it has enough material, they set up a show trial.
Today, Russian state media have made an example of him to show the effectiveness of the FSB's work, how great they are at catching alleged enemies of the people in the occupied territories, which is why articles were written about him from time to time. All the information we had was from these publications. We read all of them. We also tried to ensure that Ukrainian journalists from Zaporizhia Oblast were also kept up to date with these publications. We knew that an investigation was underway. Later, we learned that a trial was going to take place. They even said where: in the Southern District Military Court in Rostov.
Даже написали, где будут судить, в Южном окружном военном суде в городе Ростов.
First, he was held in Berdyansk, where he was detained. Then he was transported to Melitopol and held in a basement. There were very many civilians there, an unimaginable number of them. Some were held temporarily, others were released. Then he was transported to Simferopol, where he spent about 2.5 months in a pretrial detention center. Only later did he end up in pretrial detention center number 1 in Rostov. And it was from there, on October 12, 2023, that he was transported to the first court hearing.
Russian propaganda reported on Damian's detention. This is a fragment of that material.
Russian soldiers and battalions follow the footsteps of collaborators of the armed forces of Ukraine. This is one of the key stages of operations aimed at cleansing liberated cities of saboteurs who took part in the armed conflict in the Donbass and served in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine. Here are his photos and personal data. This comrade took part in the anti-terrorist operation in the territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Special file: Maxim Case, senior sailor. His personal data was found at the military commissariat in Berdyansk. The documents will help find nationalists who are hiding in the city. Between February 23rd and 28th, the leadership of the military commissariat in Berdyansk was destroying all the institution's documents. Safes were opened, and first they took out and extracted the personal files of soldiers. Some were burned, some were thrown away for disposal. Floorboards were broken and a hole was made in the walls of the building. This is how they got rid of documents or hid them in other places. A new team of the military commissariat in Berdyansk is helping to examine these abandoned personal files. Of course, a lot of these documents remained, and we try to carefully analyze them, organize the personal files of the participants of this anti-terrorist operation and various nationalist groups. We immediately pass them on to the Russian side.
Obserwując rosyjską telewizję, rosyjskie media,
watching Russian television, Russian media, from the propaganda side, we see that very often material appears there that uses people who have been drawn into the terror system and arrested in order to show how Russia effectively combats subversion in the occupied territories, how effectively it fights against the so-called Ukrainian terror. Russian propaganda constantly tries to talk about and convince society that it's threatened by some hostile actions from Ukraine. In these materials, people who have been arrested often appear. These are military personnel, soldiers who were captured at the front, or civilians who were assigned the narrative that they are terrorists, that they were planning some attacks, and so on. These are stories made up out of thin air, but these people are real. And watching this material, you can clearly see that these are absolutely broken people. These are downtrodden people, often with visible signs of physical violence. And Russian television doesn't care about this at all. And I think that, unfortunately, Russians who watch this media don't care either. These testimonies are forced, extracted from these people, spoken in front of the camera. They have no legal validity, they are unauthentic, and at first glance you can see that they don't inspire trust. And this spectacle is shown on an ongoing basis on Russian TV precisely to lend credibility to this threat from the Ukrainian side.
Yana Suvorova was detained on August the 20th, 2023. This young woman ran a Telegram channel called Melitopol is Ukraine. First, she was detained in a pre-trial detention center in Mariupol, later transported to a Russian one. She recently received her sentence, 14 years in prison.
Ale myślę też, że z drugiej strony cel jest taki, żeby tak demonstracyjnie
But I also think that, on the other hand, the goal is to demonstratively show that Ukrainians are in a really difficult situation, that their resistance makes no sense. These are steps that aim to break the spirit of the Ukrainian nation, and Russian propaganda also works in this aspect. I think it's really very shocking for families of people from Ukraine who have fallen into this system of repression to see this kind of material on Russian television, featuring their loved ones.
Broken bone, childhood memory. Joker, favorite character. He studied at Kharkiv National Air Force University. Later he came to Berdyansk, where he registered at the military commissariat. I have fully understood my mistake and want to correct it. The Russian military has lists from almost the entire Zaporizhia Oblast and will check every name to ensure the safety of residents of the Berdyansk region and the city itself. In the territory of the Berdyansk district, there are 29,713 people on the list of soldiers who served in the territory of this district.
29 человек.
W przypadku propagandy, gdy widzimy takie historie poszczególne...
In the case of propaganda, when we see these stories of individual people who were then recognized by the Ukrainian side by their loved ones, it really doesn't matter whether that person did or didn't do something, whether they were connected with the Ukrainian army or intelligence, whether they worked in administration or had any past at all. It absolutely doesn't matter. Russian propaganda is a whole other universe, a separate entity that even if it doesn't have the facts, it will create them. The show must go on, and the stories shown there also serve to satisfy Russian viewers, to confirm in them the belief that the threat is real, that the threat exists. And that's why Russia's FSB and Russian intelligence constantly report in the media that they stopped many terrorist attacks, stopped countless acts of sabotage in order to constantly keep Russian society convinced that this threat is real and that the physical security of Russians is also threatened precisely by the activities of Ukrainians.
Civilians without a trial are subject to being incommunicado, detention without contact with the outside world, without letters, without family visits, without the right to a defense. Such people are further transferred to other places outside the system, usually to old penal colonies or pre-trial detention centers, formerly outside the control of the Federal Penal Service, but under the complete authority of the FSB, where prisoners have no rights. So it's worth asking here, why actually torture civilians?
I have several explanations, but the first is that they may be doing this in order to permanently incapacitate people, that they can never again serve against Russia or join the Ukrainian army or fight for the liberation of their homeland from the occupation. That's the first reason. The second is that this may be done deliberately to taint these executioner officials, so that they become obedient cogs in the system and do exactly what their superior orders them to do. so that they are afraid to say anything or protest and blindly follow orders. But I can't fully comprehend why people are tortured in such a cruel and inhumane way, bringing them to the point of suicide. I don't fully understand.
И бесчеловечно, и как бы доводя людей до самоубийства, вот зачем это делать, я этого до конца не понимаю.
This is what Ukrainian prisoners of war look like when they are returned in an exchange, those who were on official lists. We can only imagine what the civilians who don't exist in any registers look like.
Это редукция сна, людям не дает высыпаться, это потому что, то, что восстанавливает...
It's sleep deprivation. People are not allowed to sleep because sleep is what regenerates the body. They are constantly woken up. Another thing is the food. It's horrible. As reported by human rights defenders from the organization Svoboda, based on conversations with Ukrainian prisoners who managed to regain their freedom, they were fed disgusting porridge with rat feces in it. It was boiled cabbage with rotten herring, overcooked. It was impossible to eat. After being in prison, Damian had stomach ulcers, and he was a completely healthy, strong person. This is what happened to him. In captivity, he lost 30 kilograms, and this is just one case. We talk about Damian as an example to illustrate what this situation looks like. We also documented how Ukrainian prisoners are treated. They are woken up at 6 in the morning. They are lined up with their legs spread. If one of them moves, they beat everyone. And they stand like this. They stand there from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And that's it. Why do they do such things to people?
Вот зачем так сделать с людьми? Это вот совершенно, вы знаете, это непонятно. Мы фиксировали и случаи трудового рабства, когда украинских узников...
We also recorded cases of forced labor when Ukrainian prisoners were forced to dig trenches for occupiers. And unfortunately, we also documented cases of suicides. Some people can't take it. They hang themselves using their own clothes. Others die as a result of torture, including children. Recently, 2 cases were recorded when 2 teenagers died due to torture.
В результате пыток. И, собственно говоря, вот так выглядит эта система.
But to put it bluntly, this is what the system looks like. Ukrainians in the occupied territories, and especially Ukrainian civilian prisoners, are detained in the occupied territories in concentration camps, as well as in at least 180 prisons throughout the territory of Russia.
В тюрьмах по всей территории России, их специально как будто распыляют по всей территории России.
Это ужасные на самом деле условия в России.
The conditions in Russian pretrial detention centers are terrifying. Overcrowded cells, a complete lack of hygiene. There can be up to 30 people in one cell, who of course are never let outside. There's no mention of walks. The only place where prisoners can be taken out is the corridor, where throughout the day they must stand without any movement. The food there is terrible. They feed them worse than pigs, with some food scraps. Everything is mixed. Mice walk over their heads, cockroaches, dirt. These are terrifying conditions, simply unbearable. For 30 people, there were maybe 8 sleeping places, and the boys slept there in shifts.
Вот там крысы ходят по головам, мыши ходят по головам, тараканы, грязь. Это ужасные условия, просто невыносимые. На 30 человек может быть там до 8 спальных мест, да, и ребята там спали по очереди.
We have a lawyer who periodically participates in court hearings and is present in the courtroom. Sometimes he also visits him in the pretrial detention center, but not every center has such a possibility. When my son was in Taganrog this year, in that terrible pretrial detention center, for half a year, no one was allowed to see him. My son was in complete isolation, in a single cell, where he was subjected to brutal torture. We only learned about this later when he was transferred from the pretrial detention center in Taganrog to Mariupol, and when another lawyer could reach him in the pretrial detention center.
Когда его перевели из Таганрогского СИЗО в Мариуполь, и когда к нему смог добраться адвокат в другое СИЗО, мы узнали о том, что его избивала его группа специальная, карательная, спецназ.
That's when we learned that he was beaten by a special group, the Criminal Special Forces Unit from the FSB. We learned that he didn't receive any of the packages we sent him. These packages simply fell into a void. Of course, none of the letters we wrote were passed on to him, not a single one. He was held in a single cell and in complete information isolation. He had no idea what was happening around him, and what the situation was. Every day he was subjected to terrible torture using dogs, intimidation, and other terrifying methods that are used there against our Ukrainian prisoners.
И со всеми остальными ужасными вещами, которые происходят с нашими украинскими пленными там.
The most shocking example of such a place is the pre-trial detention center in Taganrog. This is where Ukrainian journalist Viktoria Roshchina was probably murdered. She was detained in 2023 in occupied territory. After a year in August 2024, her death was announced. The Russians returned the body in April 2025 without the woman's throat, eyes, and brain.
I, Viktoria Roshchina, was part of a humanitarian convoy traveling from Zaporizhia to Mariupol. During a document check in Berdyansk, photos of Russian military equipment were found on my phone. For this reason, I was detained for clarification. Moreover, the Russians explained to me that traveling to Mariupol poses a threat because the road is blocked. In Berdyansk, I was provided with accommodation, food, and basic living conditions. During this time, I did not see any armed actions or protests. I have no complaints against the Russian side. The actions of the Russian armed forces most likely saved my health and life. I call on everyone to maintain common sense and resolve disputes peacefully.
Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Russian Federation has allocated huge resources to the expansion of the system of prisons and penal colonies, a system whose purpose is not punishment, but terror.
До войны в России существовала такая программа.
Before the war, there was a prison modernization program in Russia, and after the aggression in 2022, the Federal Prison Service announced a new modernization program, which is, simply put, the expansion of concentration camps and doubling their number. And if previously there was talk of 55 billion rubles, which is about $500 million, now this is already around 100 billion rubles.
То теперь речь шла о 100 миллиардах рублей. И после 22 года ФСИН запросил у правительства России.
After 2022, the Federal Prison Service applied to the Russian government with a request to approve this program expanding the prison system. From what we were able to calculate, the number of places in concentration camps increased from 10,000 to 20,000. We must also say that people who have been kidnapped, Ukrainian civilians in the occupied territories, are not just held in prisons. Often, these are simply basements or occupied administrative buildings that have been converted into places of torture. And in cases of forced labor, people are simply kept in pits. Currently, we are also documenting and conducting interviews with Russian prisoners after their liberation, who claim that the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant has also been converted into a place of torture.
После плена, которые утверждают, что и Запорожская атомная станция просто превращена в пыточную.
Jeśli chodzi o system więziennictwa w Rosji w tym momencie.
As for the prison system in Russia, in 2022, over 400,000 prisoners were in this system, including people in penal colonies. This was exactly 465,000 people. Now, at the beginning of 2025, according to the available data collected from organizations dealing with this topic, they indicate that 315,000 people remain there. So we see that this is a very large drop in the number of prisoners, by about 30%. We know from various sources that Russia recruited prisoners en masse to participate in this so-called special military operation. This was the Wagner Group, but also various other quasi-military or outright military formations. Later, the Russian army also took over this, let's call it, business. And this was one of the main sources of so-called cannon fodder for Russia. The prison system in Russia is a huge, extensive machine. Penal colonies are located throughout the country, and it's a very well-funded state system. A lot of people work there who would like to keep their jobs. So it seems to me that a justified assumption would be that this prison system is trying to preserve itself by drawing Ukrainians into it, meaning that Russian prisoners are being replaced by Ukrainians, enabling this system to maintain its form and funding and staff employment. Russian prisoners go to the front, and Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian soldiers, end up in Russian prisons. The question is also what the future will look like. Right now we have a system that is extensive, employing thousands of people. If thousands of people are involved in this system and get used to this violence, get used to using torture, then how will they function in the future? I think that if Russia has space to continue this kind of criminal terrorist type of activity, it will of course do so, because people are already prepared. They know how to do this. So only some serious shock, I don't know, a defeat in the war, bringing these people to justice could stop this system. The second question that also personally troubles me is how Russian society views the fact that it has such a system of gulags that directly refers to what we observed in Soviet times. How do these people view this? What emotions does this fact evoke in them? Do they even pay attention to this? And it seems to me that the answer is that people in Russia try to isolate themselves from these difficult topics and don't want to pay attention to them. The second answer may be that they are paralyzed by fear and are afraid to think about it and don't want to talk about it. But on the other hand, these people who work there, who on a daily basis perform their work consisting of torturing other people, they have families, they live normal lives. And Ukrainian activists indicated, and Russian ones too, that they tried to track down those people who were identified as members of this repression system. And they saw, for example, on social media, that these are people who have profiles with children, with families, with friends. They live normal, happy lives. And I think this also testifies to the absolute sense of impunity and the sense that they simply have the power over someone and can exercise it in such a cruel way.
Soldiers who end up in captivity still have a chance to be exchanged. Civilians don't have such a chance.
As we see, Russia is not inclined to exchange civilians. That is, either the war must end, after which Russia will be obliged to release all prisoners, or there must be a very strong pressure on this Putin regime by means of sanctions or other actions that will force it to release these many, many civilian prisoners. Many people like me, families, united and created civic organizations.
Санкциями, либо какими-то еще действиями, чтобы заставить его отдать гражданских людей, которых там огромнейшее количество. Мы создавали там, объединялись и создавались вот эти вот гражданские организации.
Already, it's a certain form of organization that can turn to the UN Committee Against Torture, for example. One can act not as a private person, as Damian's mother, but as a civic organization. And many families created such associations, both military and civilian.
Какие-то объединения такие гражданские, и вот очень много семей как бы вот создавали такие, это и военные, и гражданские объединения, вот и проходят акции по всему миру, да, вот с портретами, с такими большими баннерами.
Campaigns are taking place all over the world with portraits, with large banners, various peaceful actions and demonstrations. We try to publicize this problem in Europe and show what is happening in Ukraine in the occupied territories. We are really dealing here with a completely new phenomenon, with genocide and practices in the occupied territories of Ukraine that Russia previously used in Chechnya, and even earlier in the occupied territories of Baltic countries, and basically everywhere it could reach. This is a terrifying phenomenon. And what's terrifying for me is that this is my homeland, the country where I grew up and where I spent 38 years before I left for Estonia. That's my homeland that's doing this.
Na co zwracają uwagę aktywiści.
Russian activists and human rights defenders point out that today, Chechens who were previously repressed in the 1990s and 2000s often have a role in this Russian terror system. Namely, they become perpetrators. They were brought to occupied territories or deep into Russia in order to carry out these tortures, to carry out these difficult orders. And we see here how cynically Russia operates. This should also make a warning light go on, because we see that Russia is also partly behaving in the same way toward Ukrainians. In the occupied territories, where a large part of these concentration camps, unofficial penal colonies, are located, Ukrainian collaborators are executioners of these tortures. These experiences have already been gained and tested by the Russians, and it works efficiently. This terror system today is really a well-oiled machine, however terrible that may sound. And we can expect that these Russian plans, if they succeed, will be implemented, and Ukrainians are assigned not only the role of the victim, but in the future also of perpetrator. Irina Shved's husband went missing in 2023 in Bucha during the occupation. Irina learned that her husband is in penal colony number 1 in Tula Oblast in the city of Donskoy. Irina received this information from 2 prisoners who were imprisoned with her husband and were released in a prisoner exchange. They're hidden there. These boys, they all sit together with guards, border guard service officers, rescue services, and various others. They all sit together in those cells. They say there are more civilian prisoners than prisoners of war. When Ukrainians are exchanged, they're emaciated. We see that they were abused. And we don't know how many years will pass before there's an exchange of civilian prisoners, and if they'll survive until then.
Якщо людина, вони там бачите, які всі худі і нещасні виходять звідти. Вони стоять з 6 ранку підйом.
They wake up at 6 in the morning and it continues until 10 at night, on their feet the entire time. They have no right to sit. They have a break lasting literally a few minutes during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But otherwise, they stand, constantly upright, like this. You have no right to turn around. You have no right to bend over. They immediately run up and beat everyone at once. And if one person moves, they beat everyone. The Ukrainian authorities at least know something about the prisoners of war. Some lists exist. The Ukrainian army knows how many people ended up in captivity. But when it comes to civilians, there are no such lists. We don't even know exactly how many of these people are there.
I w kontekście rozmów pokojowych, które teraz prowadzi...
In light of the peace talks that the American side is now conducting with Russia and between the United States and Ukraine, this topic, when it comes to Russian-American talks, practically doesn't come up. On the contrary, we recently heard from Donald Trump that since Vladimir Putin fought for some territories in Ukraine and took possession of them, he will probably have to keep something. And it sounded as if he was really entitled to this. And this is very alarming because what will happen then to all those people who are in this terror system? Let's repeat, there are thousands of these people. According to Ukraine, there may be up to 15,000 people who are already in the terror system, in these prisons, basements, and are tortured there day after day. But there may be significantly more, because Ukraine claims that 70,000 people have gone missing, meaning we don't know where these people are at this moment. They may also be in these prisons. That's a lot of people, and the fate of those who are in these occupied territories depends precisely on the shape of these peace agreements. If they fall under Russian rule, if they stay there, they are absolutely condemned to the mercy of the Kremlin, and we already see what the Kremlin has done to them. This entire propaganda discussion, that Russia entered Ukraine because it wanted to defend the Russian-speaking population, wanted to spread the so-called Russian world there, some Russian El Dorado, Russian values in the defense of human rights. This is absolutely untrue, because thanks to this documentary and these kind of projects that show the truth about what is happening in the occupied territories, we see that Russia brought only destruction, death, and suffering. And this is what the future of these occupied territories will look like if they remain under Russian rule.
In order to minimize unnecessary casualties, as we did before, all possible actions should be taken to enable the surrender of Ukrainian soldiers into captivity. Those who, of course, want to do so. We know, and you know better than anyone else, that soldiers in the Ukrainian army act differently because they shoot those who try to surrender in the back and drones attack them from above, eliminating them. However, from our side it is natural. One should act and treat prisoners in accordance with the norms of international law and the legislation of the Russian Federation. The Russian army has historically always treated defeated opponents with mercy. You can find more examples in the film Prisoners, Terror System by Yevgenia Chirikova. The link is in the description.